first word in our gospel reading is then, so you know we're picking up in the middle of a story. And this is a series in the later part of Matthew's gospel where Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's come past the day we call Palm Sunday, and he's in the city, and he's teaching the crowds, and his disciples are learning, and the Pharisees are also in the background listening in and watching and trying to find ways to trip him up. And today we get the first of the scenes where the Pharisees really come after him and try to get him in a difficult position. And we'll have, the story actually goes on for 2 more Sundays, which we will miss. Next Sunday we have Reformation Sunday and then All Saints Sunday, so we step away from Matthew's Gospel. The Pharisees are at their game for a little bit. Today we have the scene where they bring Jesus what they think is a trap, and they ask him, is it legal to pay taxes or not? And they think this is a yes or no question. There's only 2 ways Jesus could possibly go with this. Yes, if he says yes, the crowds are going to turn against him. Nobody wants to pay taxes. They hate the Romans. If he says no, then the Romans will hear about it. They'll arrest him. They'll try him for treason and execute him. We'll be rid of Jesus either way. And Jesus says, no, we're not going there with this question. We're going to take things in a different direction. And he says to them, show me the coin. Show me the coin that's used for the tax. And this is a coin, as Brian said, it's got the image of Caesar on it. Caesar Tiberius in those days, and I have a picture of it just a minute, I'll show you. It's got some words on it that lead people to believe that Caesar is divine and has religious authority, and so it's considered to be idolatrous, this coin, by a lot of the Jewish people. And it turns out that Jesus doesn't have one of these, but he asks the Pharisees and the Herodians, and they happen to have one. So he's kind of made them feel a little bit uncomfortable too. The coin looks like this. This is the head and tail of the coin. Caesar on the left, and there he is on his throne on the right. And the words in Latin on the coin, Caesar Augustus Tiberius is the emperor at Jesus' time, son of the divine Augustus. So his predecessor, considered to be a god now. And Tiberius is claiming, I'm like this also. I am a divine person. On the back it says the words for high priest. So he's claiming to be a religious authority over the whole Roman Empire too. And so Jesus points out to them, whose image is this? Who does this belong to? What does this coin represent? And they said, well, it's Caesar. This belongs to Caesar. And so Jesus contrasts this. He wants them to give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And right away in their minds, just as Brian asked the question, what comes from God? One of the earliest answers to that question is, we come from God. We're made in God's image. So here's head and tail made in God's image. All of us. Everything we are to be offered up to God. God gives us everything. And Jesus wants to make the points, okay, Caesar has a little bit of a hold in your life, but God gives you everything, all that you are. And when you offer that back to God, it's an entirely different thing. Jesus says to give therefore to Caesar, give therefore to God. And the word he's using is not the word give. Okay, there's a normal word that means I've got something and you don't, and so I'm going to hand it over to you. This is a word, a better word would be to repay, or it means to satisfy a debt or an obligation. It means somebody has done something worthy of this thing that you're handing over to them. You can think of it as giving an account for. It's the word that's used when wages are paid. Not really giving, but what is right, what is proper to hand over to another person from my hands into yours. And I like the word render. I'm going to suggest that we think about the word render today. If you think back to King James, this was how it used to be translated. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar. Render unto God the things that are God. So think about this word render for a little bit. When Jesus uses this word with the Pharisees and the Herodians, first of all, he's saying render to Caesar. He's pointing out that they had a coin and he didn't. They have their positions of power and he doesn't, so they've got some sanction under the Roman Empire. And he wants them to ask, as he turns the tables on them, where is Caesar in your life? What authority does Caesar have? What little bargain has he made or deal has he made so that you're under his authority? Where does Caesar take over some of what ought to be God's place in your life? What do you get from being part of Caesar? And what does Caesar want from you? So Caesar asks for this tax of these coins that he gives you. Why not? Give it back to Caesar. And then he says to them, render to God what is God's. It asks them indirectly to think about the same thing. What comes from God? What's God's place in your life? What you have that's a covenant or blessing that's been given to you by God. And what does God require of you? And remember, this scene comes right after these 3 weeks of parables that we've had. 3 times in a row, in different ways, Jesus has told a parable that reflected on the Pharisees and the leaders, that they were supposed to be producing fruit in God's kingdom and didn't. They didn't have the faith. They didn't have the obedience. They didn't give God the honor that was due. And so they're stuck. They've asked this question. Jesus has turned it right back around on them. Why don't you then give to God, render to God, the things that are God's? Jesus shows in his own life what he means here. This is Caesar's words that appear about Jesus on the cross. This is Caesar's forces that crucified Jesus. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Jesus is following on the way of obedience on the path that God has called him onto. Render to God what is God's. Everything. Body, life, devotion, future, everything. Render to God. When we think about this word, render, it's a word that has a lot of different connotations in English, and it's worth exploring. It's pretty close to the Greek word, but it adds a little bit too. So originally it was a word that meant financial things, and we don't use it this way much anymore, but you could render a payment due, your rent or something like that. Maybe you hear this a little more often, render a verdict, when the jury turns the verdict over to the bailiff. That's called rendering a verdict. To be honest with you, the first time I heard the word render was very different from this. Growing up in Indiana with pig farms and everything, there were rendering plants. Some of you haven't had lunch yet, so we're just going to stop there. If you don't know what a rendering plant is, look it up when you're not eating. You can render an opponent harmless. How did that get in? And in our modern society, rendering is a word, it's a computer word. If you look at the animated movie on the right, behind it are all these little lines and math formulas that form the shapes and colors. So it's rendered, it's presented for us to watch. So render is a word, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's like 23 different things that it can mean in English. But they all have this sense of something given over, presented, handed off to somebody else who has a claim to it. It's done on a right basis. It's done to satisfy something that ought to be done. And that person's going to do something different with it than you do. So when it's rendered, it changes. When it's rendered, it leaves your hands and enters the other person's hands. And it's for them to use as they see fit. It's an offering of trust and faith and honor, just as God has called for it. What does it mean for us when we render something to somebody else? When we render to Caesars in our life or to God in our life? We don't live in the Roman Empire anymore. We don't have a Caesar whose godlike image is on the coin. It's a little different from us. But the same question that Jesus asks and the same thing he asked the Pharisees and the leaders to think about is for us too. Whose authority takes hold in our life? Who has something over us? Who have we submitted to? Who do we get benefits from? Who do we have responsibilities to in order that we can continue living like we do? So governments, parents, organizations, all kinds of people have some kind of claim in our life. Jesus asks us to think, who is that? What right do they have to claim something from you? And isn't it right that you should give them that little piece? Then another question to follow up on it that underlies what Jesus is asking, are these things as they should be? The authorities in our life, are they in the place that God would have them be? Or do we let those authorities take too great of a spot? Do we worry about them too much? Do we render too much to them so that there's nothing left for ourselves or for our neighbors or for God? And how is it for us to render to God what is God's? Same questions that Jesus got the Pharisees and the leaders to think about. What place does God have in our life? How is God present? How are we aware of the covenants, the blessings, the gifts that God has given us? How do we take stock and count those things and have an awareness of just how much God has given us and how much God loves us? Everything we have, everything we are is a gift from God. And what does God ask of us? What is it that God expects back from us? How are we doing at rendering ourselves to God? We still wrestle with the same exact kinds of things the Pharisees and the leaders did. We think about our taxes today, and Christian groups of different kinds worry about how much are we spending on health care or taking care of the poor or military expenses. We have ideas on how our government ought to be spending money. That's great. We should be looking at those things. How do we render that money? We can look at the authority that politicians have in our lives, an elephant and a donkey that we think are everything. But there's lots of other ways to honor God and be a citizen in public as well. One of my favorite news pictures lately in terms of this, this is from a rally where there were one group demonstrating and another group protesting, and the groups were supposed to hate each other by the things that we see in stories that come across today. And a little scene where they realized they see humanity in each other. So the authorities that are over the one side and the authorities that are over the other side that say, no, they're the bad guy, they're the ones you should be going after, is underneath God's authority. It says you are all made in God's image. You're all children of God. You're all blessed. You're all part of what God is doing in the world. So if you live in this vicinity, if you're part of the way God has blessed this world, you've been given life, freedom, and so many good things. You've been given gifts. You've been given a place in the kingdom of God that God's trying to make of this world. So Jesus calls us to think about all the authorities on this planet, where we find ourselves underneath those, where we put ourselves in those positions. And Jesus calls us to think about God's authority. Where are we in the kingdom of God? How is God calling us? How are we rendering to God ourselves and everything that we've been given? The things of God. So this week I encourage you to think about this word render, and who in your life is asking you to render something to them. And where is God, and how is God asking you to render to God your very self, all the things that matter in the world. And the last thing I'll leave you with is a little word from Martin Luther as he thinks about rendering things from his hands into God's hands. Luther said, I've held many things in my hands and lost them all, but what I have handed over to God, what I've placed in God's hands, that I still possess. So Luther's saying, in trust and faith and obedience and honor to God, whatever we render over to God, we can trust that God takes it and does something wonderful with it that blesses us and blesses the world. May this be your future. May this be your call. May this be the way that we live. As we render to the powers of the world the things that they require, but more importantly, as we render to God all the things that are God's. Amen.